Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism's second live briefing that we are organizing today in cooperation with our friends of the Center for Professional Learning of Leiden University. And let me start by expressing the hope that all of you are well and safe. And we are very pleased that so many of you are joining us today, to governmental organizations like the EU and the UN and different governments. If you are interested in more information on ICT, please visit our website, icct.nl. And let's quickly get back to the event. This event was actually planned as a real-life seminar to start with in The Hague, before we were all confronted with the COVID-19 outbreak, which forced us to go online. But I have to say, no lack of evidence of audience, I have to say, in cyberspace. Our first ICCT live briefing, which was on Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Sahel region, actually attracted over 500 registrants from 46 different countries all over the world. So our forced move online basically did allow ICCT to reach out to quite a global audience. And we are very happy to have again generated quite a large interest with this ICCT second briefing. So let me introduce you to all these friendly faces that I hope you can all see next to me. I can see them. I cannot see myself, but I hope that everybody sees the lineup that we have today. Let me introduce first to you the distinguished speakers that we have, because we are obviously very pleased to have in our midst two of the most leading researchers on this very current topic, Arie Kruglanski and David Weber. Welcome, the two of you. Professor Kruglanski is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. And he's best known, or at least I know him best, by his work on theory of closing, cognitive closing, I have to say, a theoretical frame that I think has made its way into many fields, including my field, the field of terrorism studies and radicalization studies. Professor Kruglanski is also co-director and investigator, chief investigator, I think, at Maryland START, and has done and does extensive research on motives and incentives of people and psychology of people who are dwelling into radicalization and terrorism. We are very happy to have you, Professor. And our second speaker is David Weber, who is an assistant professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University, where he uses a mixture of field surveys, but also experimental methods from social psychology, qualitative analyses, and other methods in order to analyze the factors that influence processes of radicalization, processes of terrorism, basically the pathways, if I'm correct, of people who are moving towards radicalization and terrorism. He has worked and continues to work with ICCT as well, in different projects that we run, particularly those focusing on the development of risk assessment tools in prison, for instance, in the Philippines and in Mali. We're also very happy to have you, David. Thank you. And Professor Kruglanski and Weber, together with Daniel Köhler, have published a very interesting and very case-based book, which I very much like myself, in 2019. And the book was called A Radical's Journey, How German Neo-Nazis Voyage to the Edge and Back. And they will present on this book today. And we are very, very happy that Daniel Köhler is here too, to contribute to this very interesting debate. Thank you, Daniel, and very welcome. You will contribute in the Q&A session, where you will have plenty of time to discuss with us the situation in Germany when it comes to right-wing extremism. Daniel Köhler is the founding director of the German Institute on Radicalization and Deradicalization Studies, and has long practical experience in de-radicalization counseling and program design. And his research focuses on quality standards in de-radicalization and CVE, family counseling, CVE as counter-terrorism, and right-wing terrorism. And you have also published largely on the topics also with ICCT. So very happy to have you here too, Daniel. Thanks for being here. And last but certainly not least, we are very happy to organize this seminar, as I said, together with our friends from CPL. And we have in our midst Wolle Bas, my former colleague at ICCT, who is now the project lead on security for the Center of Professional Learning. So I'm just briefly going to hand the floor to Wolle to introduce CPL with a few words. Wolle, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Renske. I'm delighted that we are able to facilitate this online briefing together with you, and especially grateful to you for chairing this briefing with Professors Arie Kruglanski and David Weber. Also great to see that we are reaching so many of you in these times with these online means. I would like to especially welcome the alumni of Leiden University's Center for Professional Learning, as well as the wider alumni of Leiden University who have tuned in for this online live briefing. For those of you unfamiliar with Leiden University's Center for Professional Learning, we as a center focus on developing both open and tailored programs for professionals, offering programs on international relations, public affairs, leadership, and security. And we see it as our task to bridge the divide between academia and practice and contribute to the continuing development of professionals. Many researchers share their insights on recent research they conducted in our programs, but they are also very keen to not just lecture to our audiences, but also to test their findings and hear more about the dilemmas and experiences of practitioners. This in turn results in very rewarding discussions and in turn feeds in future research as well. And a substantial part of our programs cater specifically to professionals who are active in the field of terrorism, counter-terrorism, and security. We work with organizations such as the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Security Services, police, public prosecutors, and many others. The theme of today's live briefing is also explored in one of our programs that we held for the first time last year with professionals who are active in the field of counterterrorism and wanted to discuss the developments on right-wing extremism specifically. This program is for Dutch-speaking audiences, including the Belgian colleagues. However, we also offer several English language programs, such as our Certified Public Management program and the Advanced Summer program on Countering Violent Extremism that we organize together with ICCT, like this briefing also. Again, I wish to thank you all for tuning in to this live briefing, and I look forward to hearing from Arie Kruglanski and David Weber. Also good to now also see Renske van der Veer's camera working, and hope also to hear from you all during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolle. I hope you can also hear me. Can somebody please nod? Yes, okay. Well, that was a challenge, troubleshooting technically and keeping to my text. So I managed the first bit at least. Thank you, Wolle, for your introduction. So let's no longer spend time on introductions here. It's about time to give the floor to the speakers, I think. Short household words. We will listen to the presentation of Arie and David for about 45 minutes, which leaves us a generous 30 minutes for Q&As, in which Daniel will also contribute. And for the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A function in Zoom, which you will find below at your screen if everything works well on your end. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, but obviously we cannot guarantee that your question will be asked. And please note that a recording of this session will be made available after this live briefing, probably through our website. And one last thing, you can help us improve our live briefings by filling in the survey that you will be presented with after this live briefing. It's very short and you can help us if you would be so kind to do so. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the virtual floor to Arie Kruglanski.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you can hear me. Is that true? Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. We are very happy to be here, very honored to be the guests of ICCT and CPL, and very privileged to have this global audience. and the opportunity to share with you some of our insights and findings on the research project that we embarked on and that has been featured in our book, The Radical's Journey, how German neo-Nazis voyaged to the edge and back. First, let me say a few words about ourselves. David and I are professors of psychology. Daniel is a political scientist. And the question that arises is, what do psychologists have to do with the study of neo-Nazis or far extremists? It's a very good question. And the truth of the matter is that it happened to a large extent by coincidence. And it was triggered by 9/11, the devastation that occurred in the United States at 9/11. Up until that time, I at least was very happy carrying out basic research in psychology in the laboratory on cognitive processing, on thought processing, on social interaction, using very comfortably university students as participants. But 9/11 changed all that. I was asked to serve on a National Academies of Science panel to study terrorism, and my life has never been the same again. Along with colleagues at the University of Maryland, I co-founded a Center of Excellence for the Study of Terrorism and the Response to Terrorism, START, and started carrying out research on various manifestations of violent extremism all over the world, in the Middle East, in Asia, and Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Maghreb, the United States, Europe, wherever it can be found, and it can be found actually everywhere. About 7 years ago, on a lecture tour of the University of Alberta, I met a very promising graduate student, David Weber, who was just about finishing his dissertation. And I lured him away from the cozy comfort of the laboratory and enticed him to join me in studying field research on violent extremism. And the rest is history. We have developed a very fruitful collaborations that gave rise to many studies, and one of which is featured in the present book. About 5 years ago, I similarly met Daniel Köhler at a meeting on law and psychology at the University of Trier in Germany. I was very impressed with his work, and we decided to collaborate on a data set that he had about neo-Nazis who decided to leave violence behind. So this is how the book came about. What is this book about? Essentially, it is based on Daniel's in-depth interviews with 40 German neo-Nazis who decided to leave the movement after many years of participation and attainment of high ranks within the organization. We were especially interested in the longitudinal, the history, the journey aspect of it. What made them join the movement in the first place? What was their life within the movement, on the inside? Why did they decide to leave? And importantly, how did they fare once they left? How did they fare back in the folds of the German mainstream society? As you all know, these days, the far-right extremists, neo-Nazis and others are enjoying a great popularity on both sides of the Atlantic, and they are launching a rising waves of attacks against various minorities. The data speak for themselves. Between the period of 2014 and 2019, the far-right terrorist attacks by no less than 320%. In the year 2018 alone, far-right terrorist attacks made up 17.2% of all terrorist incidents in the West, compared to Islamic groups, which made only 6.28 attacks. So what can we do about this threat? Many people choose to see the far-right terrorist as evil. Can I have the next slide, please? What they do is definitely reprehensible, but maybe calling them as evil is not especially helpful. Calling them as evil has a kind of finality to it, that the only thing that you can do about it is fight them tooth and nail. Calling them as evil implies that their essence is evil, that it's unchangeable, incorrigible, irredeemable. But fighting them tooth and nail, fighting terrorism and violent extremism tooth and nail, while in many cases necessary, is not solving the problem. As you know, the example of that is the global war of terrorism now in its 20th year. And despite the trillions of dollars, the many thousands of victims, terrorism is still alive and well. Organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are still attracting thousands of volunteers, are still these very days launching hundreds of attacks all over the world. So what are we then to do? Perhaps the answer is to understand the problem. And that's where psychology and the social sciences come about. Over the last several decades, our team has carried out extensive field research with terrorists and violent extremism all over the world. And on the basis of these data that we collected, and also on the basis of prior insights by major social scientists from various disciplines, we formulated a theory about the psychology of radicalization. And we applied it to the sample of neo-Nazis that Daniel connected the data about. And according to our theory, violent extremism results from a conjunction, a combination of three things, three factors: people's psychological needs, compelling narratives about how these needs can be satisfied, and social networks that validate those narratives. So we have this 3N theory of radicalization: needs, narratives, and networks. Let me explain what these are. First, the need. The need is the motivation behind individuals' decision to join a terrorist organization or a far-right movement. Our research revealed that the overriding motivation in this case is individuals' quest for significance and mattering. The interesting thing is, of course, that this need is fundamental and universal. As you see on the slide, Jean Vanier, the great humanist, asserted that all of us have a secret desire to be seen as saints, heroes, or martyrs. The desire to be recognized, to have dignity, to have respect is fundamental. The human infant vies for attention, otherwise the infant will not survive. Adult humans also vie for recognition and respect. Nobody wants to be disrespected. Indeed, major social thinkers from Aristotle, through Hegel, through Marx, Sartre, William James, George Herbert Mead, identified the struggle for dignity and recognition as a major force in social affairs, in social revolutions, in social movements, including the movements for equality, for civil rights, for gay rights, for feminism, and so on and so forth. So an individual may be motivated to join a neo-Nazi movement because they suffered a humiliation of some sort, a loss of significance, or because they were enticed by the opportunity to gain great significance, to be empowered, to feel strong, to be feared, to be respected. So here is a question. If the quest for significance and mattering is so universal, why only some individuals radicalize? Why only some individuals become terrorists, join ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the far-right movement? And the answer, of course, is in the next, the remaining two ends of our 3N triumvirate, the narrative and the network. What the narrative does is it connects significance to a given pattern of action. What do you do in order to attain significance? In plain English, the narrative tells individuals that in order to gain significance, you need to do something, to fight the presumed enemies of the Aryan race, the Jews, the Muslims, the refugees, the immigrants. And exactly just the way that the leaders are telling you to do it. Defending one's race, one's nations, one's religion is hailed as a very important value, and anybody who serves that value therefore deserves honor and significance. The value bestows honor and dignity and respect on those who serve it. Now you can see why only some persons become neo-Nazis, even though all persons have the quest for significance. Simply different people may subscribe to different narratives as to how significance is attained. These narratives may feature a different value whose service bestows significance. Values other than the race, other than religiosity, other than your nation, other than your ethnicity. For example, values of achievement, of wisdom, of beauty, of wealth. And these narratives identify different ways other than fighting of gaining significance. For instance, through hard work, through exercise, to have a beautiful body, to cosmetics, or whatever else, or through business, becoming wealthy, whatever else other than violence. Finally, the third N in the triumvirate of our three N's, please, next one, is the network. What is the network? The network is the in-group, what psychologists called our reference group. These are the people who you respect and whose good opinion you seek in return. The function of the network is to validate the narrative, to confirm that attaining significance through the pattern of action identified in the narrative is correct. And if people who you respect assert this is correct, you're likely to believe that this is so. The network has what we call epistemic authority. It's an expert whose opinion you value and are ready to follow. Relatedly, the network also bestows significance. So not only it validates the narrative, it creates a shared reality around the narrative, but it bestows significance. It's the network that honors you, that celebrates you, that views you as a hero, as a martyr, as an important person who deserves dignity and respect and significance. Now, we're studying it in German context. What is special about the German context, of course, is not the need element, because the need, as we said, is significant, is universal, is fundamental. What is special about the German context is the narrative and the network. What is the narrative of the German neo-Nazis? It pretty much reiterates the old Nazi narrative of yore. And it's the narrative that Germany belongs to the Germans, who are Aryan, to the Aryan race, and the various foreigners, Jews, Muslims, gypsies, immigrants of various kinds, and other people who are impure because they are disabled, inferior, are the enemy who threaten the purity of the race. And therefore, they have to be eliminated or at least driven away. Relatedly, the government that supports the infusion of these impurities into the country and is cosmopolitan, international, globalist, must be replaced through violent revolution, and the Fourth Reich, which is the exact successor of the Third Nazi Reich, needs to be reinstated. Individuals who attack minorities and drive them away deserve the highest praise because they implement the agenda of Adolf Hitler. Till this day, the most renowned and celebrated leader of the neo-Nazi movement. Paradoxically, some recent trends in the far-right movements make it globalist and international, something that they usually objected. And we see that the German far-right movement is making contact with the far-right movements in other countries, the white supremacist movement, who are fighting pretty much the similar enemies. And also, ironically, they are emulating the ways in which the Islamic radical movement has been carrying out its propaganda and has been learning from the Islamic movement about ways of convincing, recruiting, and carrying out attacks. Now, how about the network? In the case of the German context, the network is very interesting because the German neo-Nazi network, the subculture that subscribes to the neo-Nazi narrative and its agenda, is a continuation of the Third Reich that reigned Germany for 12 years from 1933 to 1945. In fact, from the end of the Second World War, Germany has had a long and unbroken chain history of right-wing movements, whether in the form of political parties, subcultural groups, or individuals. And very ironically, again, these developments were an unintended consequences of our own doing, because the Western allies recruited many of the former neo-Nazis or former Nazis, members of the SS or the Gestapo, into new agencies that were tasked with spying and carrying out other activities against the communists in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Now, throughout the years, these groups of neo-Nazis that continue the work of the Nazis of the Second World War carried out thousands of neo-Nazi plots and incidents, from painting swastikas on walls of synagogues, anti-Semitic slogans, bombing attacks, pogroms against refugees, assassinations, etc. In terms of the number of far-right incidents, the end of the Second World War saw the greatest number of far-right activity in Germany as compared to any other country in the world. What is also particularly interesting about Germany is the vibrant and the firm societal rejection of the neo-Nazi movement by the German society. After all, the German society was the one that suffered tremendous devastation by the Nazi interlude, by the Second World War. So it has been particularly concerned about the possibility of it happening again. And this translated into a far-reaching counter-violent extremist activities that was again unparalleled everywhere. For example, whereas the counter-violent extremism activity in the West against the Islamist movement started only after 9/11, by that time in Germany, for a decade or so, there has been a very vigorous and firm and well-developed violent extremist initiative. By the year of 2016, there were in Germany no less than 721 programs half funded by the federal government, half funded by the civil society, NGOs, and so on and so forth. In October 2000, an attack against a synagogue in Düsseldorf led Gerhard Schröder, the Chancellor of Germany, to call for a rebellion of the dissent. And in consequences, the funding scope for CVE programs expanded tremendously. And at that time, it was in the thousands. So much for the background. But now for the real interesting part of the presentation, let's turn to David Weber, who's going to tell us about our specific research.
Let's see. All right. Thank you, Arie. And thank you, ICCT, for having us here, and for all of you for tuning in. It's a great opportunity for us to be able to share research with you. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Now that you have an understanding of the theory and the context, as Arie spoke about, I want to talk a little bit about our approach towards studying the journey that these far-right members took. In our book, we present the analyses that we conducted on 35 interviews with members of former right-wing organizations. We have time in the Q&A, so I'm sure if you have questions about what those interviews were like or the actual analysis process, Daniel or myself would be happy to field those questions. Today, I'm going to focus in the talk on the findings that we had. Let me start by telling you a bit about the people that we spoke to. 80% of the people that we interviewed were men. Now, this isn't that surprising. That's what we would expect the gender split to look like when you're looking at far-right movements, whether in Europe or the United States. Majority of the people that or all of the people that we interviewed had what we would call sustained careers within the far right. Essentially, we didn't want to analyze the interviews of people who maybe joined during their youth or rebellious years for partying and drinking and then dropped out right away. We wanted to deal with people who had fully radicalized and had become fully committed to the political cause. So we restricted it to only these individuals with these sustained careers. And as a result, more than half of the people that we interviewed here had risen to leadership positions within their respective organizations. Now, in these interviews, we touched on the 4 phases of their journey that you can see on the screen. These phases are, that Arie referenced earlier, entry or radicalization into the movement. The second, what life was like inside the movement. Third, why they eventually came to leave the movement. And then finally, a phase that's relatively understudied when it comes to terrorism and extremism, which is now that they've left the movement, what is life like in the aftermath of having made that decision, and now that they're trying to reintegrate into society. In our book, we devote chapters to each one of these phases. For the talk, I'm going to try to highlight maybe 1 to 2 findings from each phase that we thought were most interesting. And along the way, I'm going to try and bring out quotes from the people that we spoke to as a way to highlight these findings. It's their words that we were analyzing, so I think the best way to do that is to present you with some of their words. Now, obviously, the natural place to begin this is to start at the beginning and to start with entry. To understand how the radicalization process of how these individuals came to join the far right. Now, I want to start by saying this is not something we just simply came out and asked them directly. Psychological research tells us that people often misidentify the true motives behind their behaviors. And so instead of just directly asking them why they joined, we instead took more of a narrative approach and asked them to tell us what their lives were like prior to joining the movement. We could then go look at their events in their lives, look at the circumstances, and try to identify different factors that would facilitate their entry into the movement. And what we found when we looked at these factors was that life was often difficult for these individuals. And more specifically, the common occurring circumstance or situation that we found was that these individuals had experienced some level of abusive or neglectful relationship, is what we would call it. And that was true for about 60% of the people that we spoke to. Now, what I want to point out here is that the specifics of those relationships weren't really important. For some people, the abusive, neglectful relationships were with parents. For some, it was with friends. Some people were bullied on the schoolyard. Some people had very specific negative interactions with foreigners. Those specifics weren't really important. What was important was the feeling that they experienced as people as a result of these experiences, okay? And the feeling that was recounted time and time again was that these individuals felt insignificant, they felt humiliated, and they felt alone. And ultimately, they came to see the right-wing movement or neo-Nazi organizations as a place where they could finally fit in and belong, and a place where they could finally have a sense of mattering in their life. Again, let me, like I said, I want to give you some specific examples. So one interview, he talked about being beaten by his mother. In his words, "As long as I can remember and comprehend, my mother just hit us. For even the smallest mistake, we got a beating. There really didn't even have to be a reason. I never experienced a level of emotional love between me and my mother." Okay. Another individual talked about how he was bullied at school. So he was overweight in his youth. He switched to a new school and he was immediately labeled as the fat kid. They called him Big Mac. And in his words, he felt like he experienced nothing but rejection and he was pushed to the periphery and ignored, right? Now, a third different experience, we had an individual who felt neglected by what we would call absentee parents. These were individuals, his parents were so busy running their business, trying to put food on the table, that they didn't give him the attention and the love that he felt that he deserved, and as a result, experienced this negative relationship. Now, this specific encounter was pretty interesting for us because it's eerily similar to an experience that was recounted by an American skinhead, Christian Picciolini, that he recounted in his memoir, Romantic Violence. If you want to go to the next slide, this is a quote from Christian's memoir where he explains what his life was like. And as you can see, what he says is, I longed for my mom and dad while they were away at work. I wanted to be with them, unsure why they're always absent. Still, it wasn't enough. I simply couldn't compete with their steadfast pursuit of the American dream. Right? And so what we see here is time and time again with the people that we spoke to, there is some level, there's these abusive and neglectful relationships are making them feel insignificant and providing them with that motivational push that is going to lead them to violent extremism, as Arie had discussed earlier. But in order to understand why they moved towards right-wing organizations specifically, we need to also look at the narrative and the network component. If you want to go to the next slide. And what we found, if we look at these two components, is that these individuals were, as it says on the screen, they were raised in hate, okay? The individuals often grew up in environments where Nazism or bigoted views were commonplace and encouraged, okay? And what we're seeing here is that some of the interviewees were acknowledging that a lot of places that you grow up have kind of subtle racism, but they felt that the communities they were raised in, it was not subtle, it was explicit, it was straightforward, and it was encouraged. Many individuals, not many, but a minority, a decent minority of the people we spoke to, they had family members who were formerly part of the Nazi regime, who then regaled them with positive stories about their time. These were usually grandparents, their grandfather, who was a member of the Hitler Youth or the Hitler Jugend. And one individual talked about how his grandfather talked so positively about his time as a member of the Hitler Youth and the values and the virtues that they stood for, right? And as a result, this individual came to value these things themselves and have a positive attitude towards what the Nazi regime stood for, and saw neo-Nazi groups in the far right currently as a place where he could hopefully find that. Now, more than just growing up in these types of environments, we also found that relationships were usually the entry point into the movement. And specifically, that entry point occurred around hate music or white power music. So often white power music was shared with them through the schoolyard, through peers, through social relationships. And it's through that music that they got the first taste of the right-wing ideology and they came to enter the movement. Again, let me give you a quote from somebody. Someone would bring a Casio cassette player and we'd listen to Lanzer and Stahlgewitter. These are two white power bands in the worst of sound qualities. Two other people would bring a case of beer or two, and we'd simply sit there shouting along with the lousy music. And that was what life was all about, okay? And so what we see going on here is this motivation has been activated. They feel alone, they feel insignificant, they feel isolated, and they're looking for somewhere where they can matter. And it's through these social relationships, through these circumstances in their environment, through this music, that they're provided with a narrative that justifies, tells them what their problem is, tells them how to address these problems, tells them how they can find significance. And those beliefs are then validated by the people they surround themselves with in their social network. And as a result, we can then see how they progress into joining a right-wing organization. Now that we see what life was like for them once they've joined, let's look at the next phase. What was life like in the movement? You can go to the next slide. And what we see here was that these individuals, once they joined the right wing, they started talking about what was an interesting dichotomy to us. So on the one hand, they talked about how being a member of a right-wing organization helped to fulfill their yearning for significance and empowerment, right? Now, on the other hand, though, they recalled a time period in their life in the movement that was full of anxiety, that was full of violence, and that was full of personal struggles, right? So there's this dichotomy of they're getting their needs fulfilled, but at the same time, it's a very struggling period in their life. Unsolicited by us, more than 70% of the people we talked to recounted how they found camaraderie within the movement. 70% recounted how they felt like they were achieving important ideological goals within the movement. And 70% told us that actively being involved in the movement was providing them with a sense of significance and importance, okay? Concerning the need for significance, that's what the quote on your screen provides you a good example of. What we have here is one of the people we spoke to every morning would go through what we call a daily affirmation procedure. She kept a little picture of Hitler on her bedside table. And when she woke up in the morning, she'd look at the picture and she would reaffirm her own value in the eyes of Hitler and tell herself he would be proud of her, right? So Hitler became a kind of God. Every morning when I woke up, I would look at this picture and I swore to live my life true to the slogan, one people, one empire, one leader. I kept having thoughts of what it would be like if the Fuhrer were still alive. He would have been proud of me, right? So we have this clear indication that this individual assesses her life and her activity in the movement, and as a result, views that time and herself as valuable, as meaningful, and as significant, right? So just a clear example of how these needs are being fulfilled. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Now, despite this sense of significance that serving the Nazi ideology afforded, what we also see is that other side of the dichotomy, this trouble in paradise piece, where life inside an extreme movement was far from blissful tranquility. And specifically what we saw was that there were two specific types of events that really colored and described their time in the movement more than any other period of this journey. And those two experiences were a feeling of discrimination and exposure to a lot of violence. And I'm gonna go through each of these one at a time. So the first one, like I said, was discrimination. Essentially what happened here is these individuals had made a decision to join a far-right group. They'd made a decision to join a group that was on the extremes or the poles of society. And as a result, they had put a target on their backs, okay? They, as a result of that, felt hostility, and they felt like what they perceived to be unfair treatment from everybody else, right? Now, what's interesting here is it's hard to feel a little bit, to sympathize with this too much, because they have made a decision to join an extreme group that does express hatred and engages in violence towards other people. But by making that choice, their perception of it is that they have been mistreated themselves, right? And they have this kind of victim ideology themselves. They talk about how this unfair treatment led them to being fired from jobs, how they were forced to leave the military. They talked about how their children would be disinvited from birthday parties when it became apparent who their parents were. Now, an interesting side is they also felt that as activists, as a movement, they felt they were treated differently than other movements in Germany. One individual recounted how Muslim activists were able to, during their demonstrations, use anti-Semitic slurs and chants, but how those types of words and chants were disallowed whenever the white supremacists were protesting, right? And as a result, felt like the government had a specific target on them and was treating them differently for their specific set of beliefs. Now, importantly, these discriminatory tensions didn't come from just without, they also came from within the movement. And specifically, we're talking about our female members of the organization. Because of the toxic masculinity that pervades the far right, women were very often discriminated within the movement. Again, let me just give you a quote from one of the women we spoke to. She said, "You won't find single women in higher positions inside the movement. Women are only a man's accessory. As soon as a woman starts acting on her own or thinking freely, they get put back in their place by the men. Thinking is not a part of their job. Women have to obey. That's what the men want them to do," right? So we're seeing both these discrimination from the outside, but also discrimination on the inside. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to discrimination, like I said, the other part that really colored and described their time in the movement was violence. Now, violence was pervasive. Now, the people that we spoke to were often perpetrators of violence themselves. Not everybody that we interviewed actually engaged in violence, But many of them had comrades who engaged in violence and they didn't do anything to stop it. Others themselves had engaged in violence against immigrants, against foreigners, and oftentimes this violence was against other members of other activists, so against members of the left wing. They would engage in violence against them. But in addition to being perpetrators of violence, they were also victims of violence themselves. Again, continuing this kind of victim narrative that they had expressed. And when they were victims of violence, what was interesting about it was often at the hands of their own comrades or their own brothers in arms. Okay? Now, early on in their journey as members, this violence often took the form of hazing or initiation rituals. Again, I'm going to give you a quote. The older members would just punch younger members for no reason, or headbutt someone and break their nose or things like that. And then it was often justified with arguments like, we have to toughen you guys up for the fight so that you know what it's like to be in a fight and you can show here and now that you're men enough to take it, right? So early on, violence was a way to try and increase commitment and toughen them up and increase their drive to be a member of the right wing. The other type of violence that came from their comrades occurred more in the twilight of their careers. So as I'll continue talking about, all of the people that we interviewed ended up leaving the right-wing movement. And towards the twilight of their careers, their comrades could sense that a little bit, right? Their comrades could sense their flagging enthusiasm for the movement. Their comrades were suspicious that they would leave, that they would betray them, and that they would return to the mainstream. And as a result, they tried to engage in violence as a way to either punish them for changing their minds, or as a way to try to convince them to stay. And what we found, it was really common for individuals that we interviewed to receive death threats, to receive threatening phone calls. We had individuals who were placed under surveillance by their comrades. So their comrades would follow them around secretly around town to try and figure out what they were doing, if they were betraying them. We had another individual who described how he was attacked by other neo-Nazis when he was sent to prison. And we had another individual who had to barricade himself, his girlfriend, and their kid inside their own house because his comrades were trying to kick down the door in their combat boots, right? So this was a very trying time for them that ultimately ended up taking a toll on their lives. And to give you an example, again, I think it's best to go directly to their words. This is what one of the people that we interviewed told us. Few people can continue to live this kind of life year after year without becoming emotionally and physically burnt out. The negative aspect of being stigmatized, socially isolated, always exposed to violence, violent attacks from opponents, and consumed by intense hatred for various enemies also tend to take their toll as time passes by. Okay, and so if you want to go to the next slide, what we're seeing here is that the things that had allowed them to join the movement and that had allowed them to maintain commitment to the movement are starting to crumble towards the end of their careers. Okay, the three N's, those same factors, their social relationships with their brothers in arms are starting to fall apart. Okay, the movement at this point was no longer accomplishing the goals that they had for themselves, and so as a result, they weren't getting that same sense of significance that they once got early on. And this violence and all these negative circumstances are really taking a toll on their life. And eventually, what we found is that these experiences led them to actually lose faith in the neo-Nazi ideology. As it says on the screen, the ideology fell apart in front of their own eyes as if it was this house of cards, right? And house of cards is one of the phrases that one of the people we spoke to used to describe it. He said it was a house of cards built on lies, an illusory world. Another person called it the greatest superstition of the 20th or 21st century, right? And so this is a really interesting finding for us because researchers who study de-radicalization and disengagement processes don't always agree on this fact. So some people propose that individuals don't actually change their opinion on the ideology. It's the other components that change, but they maintain faith in that ideology. What we found here in Germany was that I think it was for more than 80% of the people that we interviewed lost faith in the ideology in some way, whether that was very specific components of it or coming to view the entire ideology as a whole, as this house of cards, right? And that ultimately allowed them to exit the movement. I do want to say this process of shedding their belief system was not an easy process. It was not a quick process, but it was a very gradual process that happened for them. The way I like to think about it is The ideology was kind of their foundation or bedrock of their beliefs. And they would encounter difficult or negative circumstances or situations in the movement, and that would form like a crack in their belief system. They could cover that crack up, they could repair it, and they could continue, but every new circumstance that led them to question something would present more and more and more cracks, to the point where these cracks could no longer be repaired, they could no longer be ignored, and they were insurmountable, to the point where they ultimately left, right? And as a consequence, like I said earlier, everybody that we interviewed did leave the movement, because these three ends, these needs narratives and these network components had crumbled and were no longer providing them with what they were doing earlier on. Okay? And that leads us, if you want to go to the next slide, to the final phase that we studied in the right wing, and that's the aftermath, right? So what was life like for these individuals now that they've left a movement and they're trying to reintegrate into mainstream society? And good news, what we found here, you could say on the one hand, we found that the grievances and the hardships that colored their life before joining and their time in the movement had drastically reduced overall, right? So we could say that after leaving the movement, they do appear to be better off, okay? The other side of that, though, is that we find that the interviewees are expressing feelings of insignificance that are significantly higher at this point than at any other time during that journey. Specifically, they're experiencing insignificance at a rate that was 5 times higher than any of the other phases, okay? And what we see going on here is, as it says on the screen, these individuals, they felt isolated, they had lost those social relationships, they felt rudderless, they didn't have an ideology that they could count on anymore, they weren't getting that sense of value, meaning, and importance or mattering anymore because they had left the movement. And so everything that they had before had crumbled in front of them. Let me, if you go to the next slide, I can give you an example in the words of what an individual told us. This is how he described his life in the aftermath. You ask yourself, what comes afterwards? You actually need a completely new life. All of your friends are gone. Your goals in life are gone. What do you do with yourself? Everything that your everyday life consisted of is gone. Right? Another individual, one more example, I really felt like I was plunging into a deep, dark hole. I was 24 years old. For the first time ever, I had no ideology, no worldview, no rationale. The first 24 years of my life were in shambles. I eventually reached a point where I tried to end it all because I had nothing left. Right? Now, what we see, what we think is happening here is because those three ends have crumbled, those were the psychological mechanisms that allowed them to dehumanize others and to act violently against others without feeling remorse, right? The narrative and the network. The narrative told them this type of violence is okay when it's against this enemy. And if you do this violence, you'll be respected, you'll be valued, you'll help bring change to Germany, right? And then they were surrounded by people who endorsed this, who validated and acted upon it, which then made them feel like those were the right actions for themselves. Once the narrative and the network have fallen out, they can no longer justify the actions that they engaged in as extremists. And what followed was feelings of self-hatred. They started labeling themselves as disgusting. They called themselves unworthy, right? And so these feelings of insignificance really start to kick in at this point. If you want to go to the next slide. Now, theoretically, as we had discussed, what's interesting is that these same feelings of insignificance are the feelings that drove them to join the movement in the first place, right? Feelings of insignificance activate that quest to feel valued, to feel important. And by trying to, and then that leads you to join an extreme movement because you see that as a place that's a potent way for you to earn those feelings back, right? And so what research shows us is about 25% of people who break away from an extreme movement or from a terrorist group end up actually re-engaging with violence. And what we see here is that this is a big risk factor for why, right? These feelings of insignificance that they're feeling now in the aftermath, they're not able to get value. They're not able to feel like they matter now that they're trying to function in mainstream society. So the easiest option for them may be to go back to that trusty right-wing movement because, as I told you earlier, 70% or more of the people that we interviewed all recounted how that movement provided them with significance, provided them with camaraderie, and provided them with a sense of this ideology that we're fighting for. So an easy way to get those things back is to try and return to that movement, right? Now, on the bright side, what we did find is there was a sizable minority of the individuals that we spoke to who channeled these feelings of insignificance in a positive direction. Much like Christian Picciolini, the American skinhead I referenced earlier, they started to cope with these pressures by trying to fight against the right wing. They would speak out against the right wing. They would take speaking gigs. They would go to schools and speak to youth to try to dissuade them from joining. They would publish their own books on this topic. Some of them would work with disengagement programs. They would part of these CVE programs that Arie referenced earlier, and they would work to help pull people out of the movement, right? So some of them were able to take that negativity that they were feeling, and they were trying to channel that in a more pro-social positive way to fight the right wing, or what we call on the screen to fight the right fight. Okay? And that's, I'm gonna stop there. I think that provides you with a good summary of an interesting finding from each of the study, each of the phases that we examined. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll throw this back to Arie as well, and he can end with just a few concluding statements.
Okay, so what can we conclude from all this? One thing that stands out is that the lives of our interviewees were suffused with suffering. It was suffering that brought them lack of significance, suffering that brought them into the ranks of the movement. It was suffering that characterized their experience on the inside. It was suffering that brought them out. And once they were out in society at large, they felt isolated, they felt guilty, they felt lonely, they felt discriminated against. Their journey, to quote Macbeth, was a journey full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The one advantage that David mentioned is that they had the expertise, they had the experience, and based on their credibility, they could play an important role in the fight to dissuade others from joining the movement, to get others to leave the movement, and perhaps show others the way how to integrate back into society. Now, this task of exploiting their expertise in fighting the movement is not easy. First of all, they are branded in many cases as traitors by erstwhile comrades. And this is not just a labeling issue. They sometimes are in great physical danger. So it's a task that is very worthy, but at the same time, fraught with danger and difficulty. Now, two questions are interesting at the end of it all. One is, how do recent developments in Europe and elsewhere toward legitimation of far-right parties, how does that influence the violent extremism on the far right? And there are no good data on this issue, but there are two possibilities. One is that legitimation of the far right. For example, in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland gained place in the Bundestag. For the first time, the far right party is legitimate. 97 posts in the Bundestag, has been doing well in Thuringia recently. How does that affect the far right extremist movement? One possibility is that it would help them become more legitimate. So what they do is going to be increased. And the other possibility, the opposite possibility, is that because of their domestication, their entrance into the political milieu, the political scene, this is going to reduce their tendency to engage in violence because of the need of the parties to increase their voting potential and their political power. And it's interesting that there was a recent research by Jakob Ravendal in 2016 that reported a negative correlation between violent far-right activities and popularity of far-right parties. So the more popular were the far-right parties, the less violent extremism there was. But still, we do not have enough data, and this has to be watched very carefully. The other big question, of course, is now, how does the COVID-19 pandemic that has changed everything, how's that How does that influence the far-right movement? And so far, the news is not very good. The online communications that we're watching on the darknet, the Telegram, the Gab, the chat rooms that are frequented by far-right activists include not only conspiracy theories that it was the Jews, the Chinese, other minorities that propagated the virus, but also calls for action, calls for exploiting the incapacitation of society and in its reduced ability to fend for itself, to launch attacks and very disturbingly, to spread the virus. If you feel you're infected, cough on Jews, cough on minorities, visit mosques, visit synagogues. We have recently written about terrorism in the age of the pandemic, and maybe at some point, ICCT will invite us to give another lecture about what has been happening as consequence of the pandemic. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Arie and David, for a very interesting presentation. I'm not the only one who was very interested because we have a lot of questions coming in. So I will try and pose them, group them a little bit as well where possible, and try to pose them to you. But I would like to start with giving the floor to Daniel first. Maybe I can ask a more general question to you. Daniel, your book, the book of the three of you, came out, I think, in 2019, if I'm correct. And since then, a lot has happened. We have seen attacks in Europe, specifically in Germany as well, the Halle attack notably. We've also seen quite a lot happening on the counter-terrorism front, arrests being made in Germany. So a lot has been happening. So could you be so kind to basically give us sort of an update on what you think that basically the threat landscape, and maybe also your view on what has been presented is when you take the current events into account?
Of course, thank you, Renske, for posing that question to me, and thanks to the ICCT for inviting me to this fascinating event. When we wrote the book, essentially we were at the height of the so-called refugee crisis in Germany and Europe. So we did see at the time a skyrocketing of far-right violence in Germany specifically. Arson attacks, explosives attacks, attempted murder, violent crimes. So in the years 2015, 16, 17, we saw a massive increase of these types of crimes. Now, when the book came out publicly in 2019, we were past that so-called refugee crisis. So the numbers were declining already. So the absolute numbers of arson attacks, of violent attacks decreased, is still decreasing actually, but we did see some significant terror attacks, like, as you mentioned, the Halle attack in October 2019, killing 2 individuals, where a right-wing extremist tried to forcibly enter a synagogue and shoot as many members of the Jewish community as he could. Before that, in June 2019, there was a point-blank assassination of a high-ranking German politician, Walter Lübcke, who was a district president, and he was shot in his own backyard by a former neo-Nazi. I say former because the authorities considered him to be non-active at the time. He hadn't been active, he hadn't been seen in a while in the organized movement, but clearly he was still highly radical, highly extremist. And he was actually making the decision at the height of the refugee crisis when he wanted to kill Walter Lübcke because he was so pro-immigration and pro-refugees. And then thirdly, of course, the Hanau attack in February 2020, where also a person with significant racist, conspirationist thinking killed 9 individuals with a Turkish background. So we have seen these significant terrorist attacks at the same time where we see a decrease of overall numbers. But still in Germany, there are still 2 to 3 violent right-wing hate crimes committed every day, statistically. We still have a significant number. Authorities estimate about 25,000 organized neo-Nazis. Roughly half of them are violent. So we have still a very significant and violent neo-Nazi movement in Germany. So that's roughly where we are now.
Thanks, Daniel, for that update. And maybe just to stay with you for a little while longer, there's a lot of questions also on the presentation itself, but I think you conducted a lot of these interviews, spoke to a lot of these people. And there's quite a lot of questions also on the more operational side of your research. And one of the things that stand out in the questions that I've been reading is that people are very interested in, when do the cracks start to show with these people? Basically, what is the lifespan of their membership within the right-wing community? When is it that they start to feel uncomfortable? Is there something to be generalized on that? And another question that I found really interesting as well was, did these individuals actually struggle with feelings of guilt as well in the aftermath? Were they looking back on the lifespan of their membership, or at least their sort of self-association with this ideology, with feelings of remorse, guilt? How did they reflect on that? And obviously, I'm going to start with you, Daniel, but I think this is a question that is just as good to be posed to David and Arie as well. So if you want to jump in, be my guest. But Daniel, maybe you can start off.
I'll start with the second one, the guilt and remorse question. And as David has already stated, there was a lot of this feeling of falling into a black hole, into an abyss, basically. Your whole life falls apart. And with camaraderie, the friendships, the networks, but also the ideology falls apart that gave your actions legitimacy and a moral high ground. So you were, in the time of the movement, you were thinking that the violence is legitimate and what you're doing is the right thing to do. And when the moral reasoning for that falls apart and goes away, you start to realize that what you have been doing was actually wrong, was actually horrible. You hurt individuals, you recruited people, you radicalized individuals, sometimes they killed people with long-lasting repercussions. So I can remember interviews, for example, telling me, I had this cracking moment when I, in the courtroom, was approached by a mother of someone who I had brought into the movement and who was standing in court at that day. And I realized I had destroyed this young man's life. And his mother was approaching me, basically asking, what did you do to my son? And is that your vision for a true good German life, a German future? So the lifespan, the first question, is really, really very individual. Some can be in the movement for decades. Some have 5, 6, 7, 8 years before they start to crack. It really depends on what they experience and what they bring with them in terms of resilience, in terms of commitment, resources. So some people don't have another choice. They don't really have a lot of education. They don't have the strong networks to help them outside the movement. So they really depend on it, really to make a living. So they don't really know where to go, actually. So many of them realize that after a certain period of time, when they get more outsider connections, friends and family members reach out to them. Sometimes they meet members of the enemy group, left-wing extremist groups, for example, or police officers who are nice to them. So they develop these relationships. Again, David would say they have new networks that they build outside of their radical group that helps them to establish an alternative perspective. So this is something that I would throw into the ring here.
I just wanted to offer one comment. Yes, it's true. Exactly right what Daniel said about the variability of how long they stay in the movement. But there is a research showing that the average is about 10 years. So most of them do not stay forever, some more than others, as Daniel pointed out, but there is a research that's showing that the average is about a decade. And also I wanted to mention about guilt. I remember one story sticking out of an individual who felt particularly guilty about kicking a pregnant woman in the belly. That stuck with him. You know, during that movement when everything was permissible, all violence was okay, he did that and he lived with guilt for the rest of his life with it.
Well, that's quite a shocking example, I think. David, do you have anything to add, or do you want to leave it?
I think I can leave it there. I think the other two did a beautiful job explaining that. Yeah.
Okay, let's just briefly move from the more operational side of your research, if I can call it operational, to the presentation. There have been quite some questions on the first bit of the presentation. So Arie, your 3N model, basically, And one that really stands out, it's been posted a few times, is there's an interest in how the narrative actually compares to ideology. So how is a narrative different from the ideology? There were questions also about, do different threads of narratives actually form an ideology, and how do these two concepts hold within your thinking? So if you could maybe elaborate on that a little, is that a...
Yes, with pleasure. By the narrative, we actually mean the ideology, but ideology does not have to be a complicated system, a theological system or a philosophical system. It can be something very, very simple. It basically consists of three components, this kind of narrative, that there is a grievance, an unfairness, an injustice perpetrated against my group. It could be a national group, ethnic group, religious group. There is a culprit, there is an enemy that is responsible for that injustice. And there is a method of violence that is legitimate, both morally and instrumentally. It's effective. So it does not have to be a very complicated, a lot has been said about ideology. All it has to be is a justification. We are, cognitive beings. People need some cognitive justification. Why do? They need to have some rationale for what they do. And that rationale is what we call the narrative. It's not ideology in any complicated sense. It's the grievance, there was an injustice, there was a culprit, and there is a method. Once you have these three elements, it is enough to justify action on behalf of that narrative to fight the enemy and to attain the significance that this brings.
Thank you, Arie. There's obviously something that we have not touched upon in the Q&As yet that has been asked a lot of times. Very imaginable questions, lots of interest in your theory, in the interviews that you've had, but the big question is, so now what? What can we do? How can we can we de-radicalize these people? Obviously a big question in the general field of radicalization and terrorism, but also can we reverse these dynamics within the triad of ends, basically, that has been posed by you, Arie? And can we do that in programs, particularly when these programs are usually put upon somebody without them having a lot of choice, whether they want to actually take part in these programs or not, whether it is in a prison setting or somewhere else? Basic question, what can we do? How effective can we be countering what you have actually researched and your findings in your research? Probably a question for all three of you. So I don't know, is there anybody who's very keen on elaborating on this first?
Just to start it and then maybe give it to Daniel and David to continue. The question is whether they can be de-radicalized. And the question and the answer to that is yes, they can be de-radicalized because some of them were de-radicalized. The likes of Christian Picciolini and others who now are leading the fight against it. We carried out on a very different type of radicalization. David and I and our team carried out research on the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka. We interviewed all 12,000 of them and they de-radicalized. We have empirical evidence that they de-radicalized. So they can be de-radicalized. And the way to de-radicalize them theoretically is provide them with a different narrative, provide them with a different network. Families are very important. And I know that Daniel has used the family connection to a great extent, and have them provide them with an ability to satisfy their need in a different way, in a constructive way. How this is done and whether programs are effective, I would like to ask Daniel to address that because he has had a lot of experience with CVE programs in Germany, at least.
So I think that it's safe to say that it's possible to de-radicalize a hardcore extremist or terrorist. Not every single person can be successfully de-radicalized. It depends a lot on what many people call cognitive openings, their willingness to engage, if they actually see a need to change. It's the exact same thing with any other form of behavioral or psychological change. If you don't see a need, if you are happy where you are, you will not change. It's easy as that. If you have any kind of cracks, if you are suffering, if you have any doubts, then there is a first good start of de-radicalization or disengagement process. What it actually is in the end, it's quite contested among practitioners and researchers. Some would say, forget about de-radicalization. The only thing we really can see is if they obey the law. It's not our role to watch in their heads and to change their minds and political opinions. Others would say that we need to work on those psychological factors that drive them towards extremism and terrorism, so what they find attractive. We need to change these as well. But I don't want to get into that debate. I would say that we have seen from a lot of practical experience and research that successful CV programs usually work on 3 levels, which is the pragmatic level, the physical level, finding people a new job, a new place to live, a secure environment, everything that they really need to survive outside the extremist environment. Second, CV programs usually work on some ideological level, some psychological level, where they address the narratives, the underlying rationale. And third, you have the affective environment. So finding new friends, solving any family issues, finding pro-social environment, be it in sports and hobbies, in school, wherever you actually can meet and socialize with people who are not violent extremists. So these 3 levels are key for most successful CV and de-radicalization programs.
Yeah, and I'll just continue that discussion, add to it a little bit. I think one of the things that's promising for us in the results that we had was that we did see a majority of these people were letting go of the ideology. From our perspective, if you break from the ideology, that should lead to a longer, sustained leaving from the movement and less likelihood to return. And in terms of what programs can do, you should be able to put together strategies within a program that can replicate what is going on in these individuals' lives. A lot of what Daniel had talked about. I think one thing that we often miss in these programs is that programs often target the narrative first because they think this is politically driven violence and it's driven by an ideology. So let's first go after the ideology. But what psychological research has shown us for decades is that people are often very resistant when you try to question their belief system. And what's great about the 3N model is that it shows that the reason people are resistant to these ideologies, to question their beliefs, is because of the networks and because of the need. The ideology tells them how they can be valued, and the networks that they have hook them into that. So if we can first break up the network and help break up the need and show them there's a different way that they can feel significant, alternative route, we have a better chance at then breaking down their connection to the ideology. And so I think that it's the same 3 things that Daniel had talked about addressing, but if you can first go after the need and the network component, you should have much greater success at reducing their connection to the ideology. And if I go back to the data just one more time, we had 50% of the people that we interviewed actually participated in disengagement programs and the other 50% didn't. And so we ran some analyses to try and see what was different between these individuals in their actual leaving the movement. And we found kind of 2 conflicting findings here. On the one hand, people who use disengagement programs were met with greater violence from their comrades. And so the way we saw that was, if your comrades know you've hooked up with a program, it's a clear statement to them that I'm serious about leaving. And as a result, they were met with more violence and with more hostility. But at the same time, those who used these disengagement programs experienced significantly lower levels of shame and insignificance and guilt. And so hooking up with these programs did provide them with some kind of buffer and did protect them in the aftermath to hopefully help reintegrate them successfully into society. I'll end there.
Thanks, all 3, I think. So for me, that's just my personal reflection, but in a sense, you're talking about the effectivity of programs, but anything you do in these programs is basically deeply personal, right? It's about needs, it's about personal drivers. So the scaling thing, I think, would be the most interesting issue to further investigate here, right? Yeah, I'm seeing people nod. Okay, another question on the need of significance. It's also a question that I have personally. How does the sort of human intrinsic need for significance, because I think it's a universally acknowledged need in human beings, how does that hold when it comes to radicalization to the possibility of online escape? So the possibility that people in the present day and age can basically go online and present themselves with a persona, with a different version of themselves that would allow them to maybe create easier access to these needs they have, access to significance, present themselves in a different manner that they are maybe unable to do in real life. Is that something that you have thought about? So basically the modern context with in relation to the conceptual theoretical frame that you have.
Yes, I think that the online situation, the platforms that offers possibilities for connecting that are not that were not available before. And one thing about it is that you can, whatever your views, whoever you are, you can find similarly minded others. You can find your own network. So if you feel that you know you have a certain attitude that is deviant from society at large, you can find others on the network in chat rooms that would have a similar view. You can be supported in a way that you were not able to do before. And that's why these chat rooms and online communications are so supportive of violence. That's the big, you know, they are spreading the violence, they're recruiting individuals in a way that was not possible before, because no matter what the distance, no matter where you are, you can always find support for deviant ideas and support for violence. So I think that the online situation changed things primarily by providing the network and also your ability to present yourself in a way that you would find attractive, as committed, as strong, as extreme enough to be respected and dignified.
I would like to add that I fully agree with Arie here. A couple of years before we wrote the book, I did a study where I actually interviewed former neo-Nazis and asked them about the role of the internet in their radicalization process. And what struck me at the time was that they described their online lives as more real than their offline lives. So our understanding, what we usually say, well, you did it, you said, you know, what's the reality of their real lives versus the online lives? They would say, I had, for example, had a choice of going out to my village and meet with these 3 skinheads and drink beer, or I could play games with someone in South Africa, I could watch movies with a neo-Nazi in America, I could chat with a neo-Nazi in Russia. So they were actually feeling much more alive in reality in the online community than in the offline world. They simply have more opportunities to engage, to socialize with them online through social media. So that was very, very important here to say that they felt actually be part of a real movement, of a real group, instead of the offline world. And they would say that, of course, it's the connection between online and offline environment. Just because you're posting a chat message saying, I want to kill someone, doesn't mean you're actually going to do it. Saying and writing something is one thing, the behavior is another thing. And as psychologists, Arie and David, you will actually be able to say a lot about the link between speech and behavior. But they would say that, for example, they would meet in a group offline to do barbecue or to listen to songs, music, go on a concert. And then they would talk about this online in chat groups, or they would post videos of bombs they've built and shown that they're actually offline doing something to advance the cause of the group. So it was this constant back and forth between online and offline that pitched these individuals forward and forward and forward and created kind of a force on its own, that they need to prove to the online community that they're still committed offline to the environment.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was still muted. That happens online. Thank you for answering that question. I think we're sort of nearing the end. So audience, if you have any final questions, I would urge you to now put them in the Q&A. Let me see, we also have had some questions from our YouTube audience. They have been looking at our live stream. A fundamental question there, I think, but we already touched upon it a little bit. There are quite a few numbers of programs that are used against the growth of the far right, but this listener has the idea that the far right is continuing to growing more. So is there anything that you can say that we are not doing now, not necessarily about de-radicalization programs, but anything that you have heard from your research or ideas that you have, innovations that you know of, that we could use in the practitioners, on the practitioners level, on the policymakers level, and that they might not have thought of yet, that would help us counter the growth of the far right movement, but also maybe to change people on a more case level?
I would like to address that. I think it's a struggle. It's a struggle. There are conditions in the world today over several last decades that promote the growth of the far right movement. There is a great turmoil, the great unprecedented wave of immigration that introduces uncertainty and uneasiness into societies. There's been the economic crisis, and now the pandemic introduces a lot of uncertainty. And the appeal of the far right movement is twofold. It's, first of all, it offers certainty by providing a very clear-cut narrative, black and white, us versus them, evil versus good. And that's very attractive in a case in times of uncertainty. And it also offers a way of gaining significance, because uncertainty is not only about uncertainty in the world at large, it's an uncertainty about the self. What do I mean in times of this great crisis, this great turmoil? And so this self-uncertainty is answered by the far-right extremism very effectively. And also one more aspect is that violence that they propagate, that they promote, is a very primitive and primordial way of gaining significance. Violence is not just another way, it's a primitive way, it's a primordial way. That's how animals do it, that's how little children do it, that's how sophisticated nations do it, by trying to be the strongest, having the greatest nuclear arsenal and so forth. So the link between violence and significance, which is part of the far-right movement, is very strong. And now these are circumstances where we can see the growth of the movement. All it means that we have to pose a counterforce. We cannot let it go unchecked. We've got to learn from psychologists and political scientists and others how best to deal with it, because otherwise it's going to, to swamp the world, and we do not want that to happen.
I think that is a great note to actually end this briefing on. We should learn from each other, our different fields. And in that way, we can counter even the most fundamental elements of the threat that link to our personalities. At least we hope, because measuring the effect will always stay a very difficult question. I think we didn't even touch upon the rows and rows of questions that were about the effectiveness and the ability to measure success when it comes to countering terrorism and radicalization broadly, but also on the right-wing extremist front. Lots to talk about, but we have come to the end of this live briefing. So let me first thank the three of you for your contributions and your very interesting book and research. Thank you also to everybody who's tuned in today, whether you were listening and looking at us through YouTube or through our live briefing channel. We are very much looking forward to seeing you at our next live briefing. If you want to keep in touch with ICCT and CPL to hear when the next briefing will be on, please visit our website, icct.nl, or find CPL at the website of the University of Leiden, and we will keep you posted. Thank you very much. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for tuning in today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.